Welcome to episode 2 of our general physics. So in our episode 2 we are going to continue with general physics, but in this video we are going to be looking at 2024 physics. So in this video we are going to be solving 3 questions. One will be on time, the other one will be on force, and the other one will be on energy. So before I start, don't forget to subscribe, comment and share the video if it was helpful. So the question is saying figure B1.1 is showing the time recorded on a stopwatch for 40 complete oscillations by a learner during an experiment on a simple pendulum. So this clock we are seeing here was used while the student was measuring oscillations of the simple pendulum. So they said this student completed how many? 40 complete oscillations in how many minutes? 1 minute 40 seconds. So these are the data which we have. So the first thing you need to do in physics, you have to correct data, understand what the question is asking you to calculate. So after understanding what the question is saying, let's read our first question. So our first question is saying state the time in seconds for the 40 oscillation. So the first question is quite simple. Why do I say so? Because you are only required to convert the time to what? To second. No need of calculation. So if we go back to our question is saying the learner took what? 1 minute 40 seconds for 40 complete oscillation. So meaning the time they want us to convert to second is what? 1 minute 40 seconds. So you say 1 minute is equals to 60 seconds. So meaning you have converted what? The 1 minute. And you just add this now what? The 40 seconds. So you say 60 seconds plus 40 seconds, which will give us what? 100 seconds. So our first answer is 100 seconds. So here our time in second is what? 100 seconds. So remember, in physics units are very important. So whenever you are solving, whenever you are calculating, don't forget to indicate the correct units. So moving on to our second question. Our second question is saying calculate the period of the pendulum. So how can you calculate the period of the pendulum? So remember, the period has a formula which we use whenever we are calculating the pendulum. So the formula for period which you need to know is period is equals to time over number of oscillation. So remember, T stands for time taken. Then we have N, which stands for what? Number of oscillation. So these are the two terms which you need to understand. And of course, this capital T stands for what? For the period. So how can we calculate now the period? So remember, we have what? The number of oscillation, which was what? 40. And remember, we have converted our time into what? Into seconds. And here you have to pay particular attention again to units. So remember, here time should always be in seconds. So that's why the first question required us to convert this 1 minute 40 seconds into just what? Seconds, so that we can use them on the next question. So if you get the first question wrong, meaning your second question will also be wrong. And also your third question will be wrong. So that's why physics, you need to pay particular attention to the first question, because once you miss the first question, you will fail all the question. So now that we have known the formula which we are going to be using to calculate the period, we'll say what is the time. Time we calculated it to be 100 seconds. So here is a period is equals to time over n. So remember, in physics, always start with the formula. The formula is important. So now you say 100 divided by how many oscillation we have? 40. So if you divide 100 divided by 40, you find your answer to be. So if we divide 100 divided by 40, you find your answer to be 2.5 seconds. And remember, period is measured in what? In second. So always they will give you at the end where there is time. So that's where you are supposed to put your answer. So when they say time, you say 2.5 seconds. Yeah. So which means you have gotten your 2 marks. Simple as that. So how do you get your 2 marks? So the first mark is where? Here. The formula. Then the other mark is for the what? For the answer. So that's why you should make sure write the formula first. Then the next question is saying calculate the what? The frequency of the pendulum. So we know that frequency has two formulas when we are calculating it. So if you have the period, you can use the formula which is frequency is equals to 1 over period. So whenever you have period, you can use this formula to calculate what? Frequency. This is the simple formula which you can use to calculate what? Frequency. But in case you don't have what? The period, the formula which you can use for frequency is equal to number of oscillation over time. Yeah. So meaning frequency is the opposite of what? Period. So if you don't have the period, you can use number of oscillation divided by what? Time taken to calculate your what? Your frequency. So in our case, since we have the period, we are going to use this formula. So you say frequency is equals to 1 over period. Remember, I told you the formula is very, very important. So we have 1. What is our period? 2.5. So if you punch this on your calculator, you find that your frequency will be 0.4 hertz. And remember, the units for frequency are what? Hertz. So I'm making sure to talk about the units, because physics, you can solve the question correct up to the final answer, but once you forget the units, your answer is wrong. So pay particular attention to units as you are revising your physics. So moving on to our second question, which is on force. So this question came basically on Newton's second law of motion. So the question was asking us to state Newton's second law of motion. So how can you state Newton's second law of motion? So Newton's second law of motion, you can state it based on what? Acceleration. So how can you state it based on what? Acceleration. So in case you forget the definition, or in case you forget the law, you can start by writing what? The formula first. So you can say force is equals to mass times acceleration. So this is what Newton's second law of motion state. So now, since we are defining it in terms of acceleration, so you divide by mass. So meaning acceleration is equals to force divided by mass. So meaning this will be our definition. So how can we write this in terms of words? So you can say that Newton's second law of motion states that the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force acting on it and inversely proportional to its mass. Yeah, so what does this law mean? So this law basically means that the acceleration of an object is directly proportional. So meaning if you increase the force on an object, its acceleration will also increase. But if its mass increases, its acceleration decreases. This explains why it is easy for someone to push a chair, and it is difficult for someone to push a fridge at the same time, because the chair has a smaller mass compared to the fridge. So this is how simple you can define Newton's second law of motion. So in case you forget, just write the formula. You can get the definition from the formula. So moving on to the next question. So the next question is saying a block of mass 500 grams is put from rest on a horizontal frictionless bench by a horizontal force and attains a velocity of 8 meters per second in 2 seconds. Calculate the acceleration. Then second, calculate the value of the force. So even if the question has no diagram, you should make it your goal to at least draw the diagram so that you understand what the question is talking about. So the question is saying we have a block. So you can just draw maybe a simple diagram showing a block. Then they said on a horizontal frictional surface, meaning there is no friction. Then they say there is a force which is pulling it. So you can just say here there is a force. Yeah. Then they are saying the acceleration is 8 meters per, the velocity is 8 meters per second in 2 seconds. So we have our velocity which is 8 meters per second in 2 seconds. Yeah. So now the question is asking us to calculate the acceleration. So here is where most of the pupils get the question wrong. They rush into solving without understanding the question. Remember, the formula is asking us to calculate the acceleration. But here we have the velocity and time. So meaning we cannot use this formula for force and mass to calculate the acceleration, but we can use the one which has velocity. So you say acceleration is equals to final velocity minus initial velocity divided by time. Why are we using this formula but not the formula for what? For force and mass? Remember, in the question, we don't have the force. So if we don't have the force, we cannot calculate the what? The acceleration. We cannot calculate the acceleration using this formula for what? For force. So don't rush into solving. First, understand the question. So then, after understanding the question, you know that this block was put from where? Rest. And we know that whenever we hear the word rest, what should come into our mind is what? 0. So whenever you hear the word rest, automatically you should be thinking about what? 0. Then the question is saying in 2 seconds it attained what? A velocity of what? 80 meters. So after that, they haven't mentioned if it attained another velocity. So meaning this was the final velocity. Our initial velocity was what? Rest, which is 0. So meaning we have all the values now to calculate what? The acceleration. So now you can say acceleration is equals to final velocity, which is 8, minus 0, which was the initial. Then you divide by time, which is 2 seconds. Then you have 8 divided by 2, which will give us 4 meters per second squared. So remember, acceleration always has what? A square. So 4 meters per second squared. So again, once you forget the square, meaning your answer is wrong. So moving on to our second question. Our second question now is the one which is requiring us to calculate the what? The force. So remember, the formula for force is force is equals to mass times what? Acceleration. So this is Newton's law or Newton's second law formula. So remember, we are calculating for what? For the force. The acceleration we have calculated already. But again here, don't rush into answering. Remember, the mass here should be in what? In kg, not in grams. So mass should be in what? Kg. So this is where physics for most pupils become difficult. You do not pay attention to what? To the units. And examiners know that most students rush into solving. So that's why they make sure they change the units so that you might solve the answer, but due to units, your answer becomes wrong. So if we look at our units, the mass we have is in what? Grams. So we have to convert it from grams to what? To kg. And we know that 1 gram, 1 kg is equals to 1000 grams. Then you say if 500 grams is what? So meaning you are going to divide what? 500 divided by what? 1000 grams, which will give us 0.5 kg. So meaning our mass is 0.5 kg and not what? 500 grams. So the moment you use this to solve, your answer becomes what? Wrong. So meaning we are supposed to use 0.5 kg. So now you say force is equals to, our mass is what? 0.5 times, what is our acceleration? 4. Then 0.5 times 4, we get our force to be 2 newtons. Meaning we have solved the question. Now imagine if we use 500 grams. If you multiply 500 grams times 4, you are going to get your answer to be what? 200 newtons, which means your answer is wrong, just because you used the wrong unit. So remember, mass should be in what? Kilograms. Then the acceleration should be in meters per second. Then when we are talking about the pendulum, always remember time should be in seconds. Those are the SI unit. So moving on to our final question in our episode 2, which is talking about what? Energy. So the final question, we are going to cover the topic which is energy, power and work. But we are going to solve just the question on energy. Yeah. So the question is saying, the figure below is showing a simple pendulum bob of mass of 200 grams swinging from position A to position E. So remember, first read the question twice. This diagram is showing a bob of a pendulum of mass of what? 200 grams swinging from position A to E. So after you have read the question, take note of the values you have been given. What are the values? So in the question, we only have one value, which is the what? The mass. So you write it, mass is equals to 200 grams. So this is our data. Yeah. So moving on again to the next part of the question. So the question is saying, at position B, which is here, the pendulum bob is 120 millimeter away from the ground and has a speed of 0.90 meters per second. So they are telling us when this bob reached position B, it had what? The speed of 0.90 meter per second. So remember, speed and velocity are one and the same thing. So we can say velocity is what? 0.90 meters per second. Then we also have 120 millimeter, which means this is our what? Height. Because we are saying it's from the ground, you are going up, meaning it's height. But if it was going horizontal, we could have said what? Distance. So height, we go vertical. So meaning we have 120 millimeter. So meaning we have taken note of all the values which you have been given, and we have identified which values they are. So now moving on to our first question, which is saying, calculate the kinetic energy of the bulb. So the first question is requiring us now to calculate the kinetic. So how can you calculate the kinetic energy? So we have the formula for the kinetic energy, which is kinetic energy is equals to half mass times the velocity squared. So this is the formula for kinetic energy. So for those of you who want to learn more about the kinetic energy, I've made a separate video where I explained the kinetic energy, including the potential energy together, and I've solved some questions. So be sure to check it out, and don't forget to subscribe. Yeah. So this is our formula which we are going to use to calculate the kinetic energy. So remember, in the question, as we are writing the data, we wrote what? The velocity. We also wrote the what? The mass. So meaning it is possible for us to calculate now because we have the values. So I have seen the importance of first writing the what? The values you have been given in the question. It will help you to know which formula you can use. So now, before rushing into solving again, check the unit. Always remember to check the unit. What is the mass? So the mass again is in grams. So before you solve, change the mass to kg. So you say 1 kg is equals to 1000 grams. Then you say 200 grams is equals to x. Then you close multiply. We have 1000 grams, x is equals to 100. Then for us to find x, we divide both sides by what? 1000. So meaning our answer will be 0.2 kg. So meaning this is our mass which we are going to use instead of what? Using the 200 grams. So that is the first step. Once you miss this step, meaning your first answer will be wrong. So now you can start solving because you have converted. So now next you write the formula. Kinetic energy is equals to half times the mass times the velocity squared. So we have half. What is our mass? 0.2. What is our velocity? 0.90 meters per second. Yeah. So if you multiply, this is squared. So if you multiply 0.09 squared, you find your answer to be 0.81. Then if you divide 0.2 in here, you have what? 0.1. Then if you punch this on the calculator, you find that your answer is 0.081 joules as our what? As our kinetic energy. So this was the kinetic energy the bulb had at position B. Simple as that. So now you move on to the next question, which is requiring us to calculate the gravitational potential energy. So before calculating the gravitational potential energy, you have to identify what is this. So the gravitational potential energy, this is the energy an object possesses due to its what? Height. So remember, in the definition you have height. So meaning also when you are calculating, we are supposed to include the height in the question. Because if an object is on the ground, it does not have any height. Meaning it does not have the what? The gravitational potential energy. But if the object is positioned at a certain height, for example, at 120 millimeter, meaning it has what? Gravitational potential energy because it has height. So now, since we have understood, so what is the formula? So the formula is quite simple. So the gravitational potential energy is equal to mass times the gravitational field times what? The height. So this is the formula which we use to calculate the gravitational potential energy. So going back to our data, what values do we have? Do we have our mass? Yes, we have our mass. Always use the mass which you have converted to kg. So our mass is what? 0.2. Do we have our gravitational potential energy? Of course, we have it. They may not give you in the question, but this is standard. Whenever you see the gravity, always remember that it's 10 meters per second or 10 newtons per kg. That is the gravitational potential. That's the gravitational acceleration. It is always the same. It's 10. So we say 10. Do we have our height? Yes, we have our height. But do not rush. height should always be in meters. Distance, height should always be in meters. But in our question we have in what? Millimeter. So that's where now the what? The part for you came. So you are supposed first to convert. So if physics you want to pass, always start with the units. Convert the units to their SI units. So we are going to convert now the height from 120 millimeter to what? To meters. So you say 1 meter is equal to 1000 millimeter. Yeah. So now you say if I have 120 millimeter, how many meters are there? So now you say 120, you divide it by what? 1000 millimeter. So for those of you that don't know where the 120 over 1000 millimeter is coming from, be sure to rewind the video and come to where I did the 1 kg to 1000. You understand? So I simply basically dividing 1000 into 120 to find our height in meter. So what is our height now? So our height is 0.12 meters if you punch on the calculator. So now we have everything we need to calculate the gravitational potential energy. So now we say 0.12. So if you multiply everything on the calculator, you find your answer to be what? 0.24 joules. So this was our gravitational potential energy, 0.24 joules. So this is how simple questions are if you understand the question from the basics. So start building up from the question itself. So now moving on to our final question. What is the internal energy of the bulb? So whenever they talk about the internal energy, this is just the total energy which is stored in an object. In other case, they are asking you for the mechanical energy. So in our case, since here we only have two types of energy, which is the kinetic and the potential. So you say now the internal energy or the total energy is equal to the kinetic energy plus the gravitational potential energy. What is our kinetic energy? 0.081 plus 0.24. If you add, you find your answer to be what? 0. Yeah, so if you punch on the calculator, you find your answer to be 0.321 as our final answer. And it is also in what? In joules. Meaning if you solve like this, you have basically gotten the first three questions correct. So remember, in physics, always the first three questions you encounter will be on general physics. So if you revise through these videos carefully, you might get all the questions correct. The first three questions. So stick through for our episode 3 and 4, where now we will discuss about 2023 and 2022 past papers.